I'm Nadia Duke. I'm Vice President for Programs at the National Endowment for Democracy. We work very closely with Freedom House and have done for many years on various programs, not just Ukraine. But actually, this is the first time I've been in this particular office because I know Freedom House has moved around. Just very brief introductions. David Kramer, who's in his own office, so probably I don't need to make too much of an introduction. David has been a long-time observer of Ukraine, has worked professionally both in government and out of government on Ukraine and also on the region. Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President at the Atlantic Council, also has worked on Ukraine, I know, both in government and now out of government, both of whom contributed to the report, which they are going to tell us more about today. And just to save time, maybe I should hand over. I understand that you both just came back from a trip to Ukraine. The report has been out for a couple of months. I did actually read some fairly sort of negative and well, the report was noted, and there was a lot of pushback and vigorous argumentation as to why it was not so, because there are some critical points here. It covers a very broad range of issues, so maybe I should actually give you, hand over to you and see how you want to, where you want to take this discussion.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Do you want me to start? Sure. Well, first, thanks, Nadia, and to Nadia as well for the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for organizing this. I know it's taken a while to do it, but appreciate your patience and indulgence as our schedules were going to get matched up. We decided to do this report in part because of concern about where Ukraine had been going in the first year under the Yanukovych presidency. We at Freedom House downgraded Ukraine from free to partly free in our annual Freedom in the World report, and that was a reflection of concerns that we had seen on a number of issues, including the concentration of power, the local elections that were postponed from May to October, pressure on journalists, pressure on judicial authorities to implement decisions that the government seemed to want, selective prosecutions along the same vein, and in general there was growing concern about where the country was headed. So based on the downgrade that we had done in January in our annual report, we thought there was a need to do a first-hand assessment of the situation there, and so I wanted to bring along with me some very highly respected experts who know Ukraine, but who also haven't been caught up in what I think has become a fairly polarizing debate in the West about Ukraine. And so Damon, fortunately, was able to join. Bob Noreck, who's also affiliated with the Atlantic Council, came along. Evan Alterman from Freedom House was instrumental in putting everything together and contributed as well. And as a result of a trip we took for a week in Ukraine in February to Kiev, Kharkiv, and Lviv, and we produced this report that came out here in Washington at the end of April, and then last week we were in Kiev to roll it out there. I think the reaction that we heard, at least while we were there, and we unfortunately last week we were there very briefly, was one that at least the government on the surface was taking the report seriously. Anna Gehrman came to the event we did and sat, interestingly enough, right next to Grigory Nemiria, made for some slight interesting dynamics, although I think the reports were a little exaggerated. There weren't fireworks there. And she offered, I think, a rather vague response, but one that was more positive than negative. We also had met earlier that morning with the foreign minister, and I think got a similar kind of reaction. And I think overall, our sense is that they are not dismissing the report, they're not attacking the report. Some officials have. Mr. Tabachnik in particular has not been favorably disposed to the report, in part because of a specific recommendation that Dane will get into. But overall, I think what we've seen, at least on the surface from the government, is a reaction that was more positive than might have been expected.
Actually, maybe you could just summarize very briefly, since I know we're sort of on the record here, for those who may not have had access to the report but will
Sure.
be viewing the discussion, maybe just briefly,
Yep.
what were the main recommendations?
Okay,
and-
recommendations I'll leave to Damon on policy, but let me offer 4 broad conclusions that we came to. One, along the lines of what I've mentioned already, is concern about where the country's going. And in fact, if left unchecked, that the country will move in a more authoritarian direction. The consolidation of power, concentration of power in the hands of a small circle. The role of the SBU, and by SBU, we don't just mean the SBU, we mean also the Ministry of Interior, the security services more broadly. Pressure on journalists, where we heard from journalists who made the case that there is growing pressure and there is a return to a degree of self-censorship, which is always hard to measure. The use of the judicial system to carry out political vendettas, which leads to the next part of it, concern about the selective prosecutions. And just today, of course, is the trial for Yulia Tymoshenko, who came out firing, blasting the trial process and the prosecution against her. The local elections, where we had serious concerns about the conduct of the October elections, which were a real setback from what we had seen before. So that's the first conclusion. The second is that the opposition also doesn't inspire Ukrainians very much. I think a lot of Ukrainians, when they went out in 2004 and hoped for a much brighter future, then became disillusioned rather quickly, and the opposition hasn't changed a great deal since then. And I think there is no, and this gets to the third conclusion, which is the civil society, while still fairly vibrant, we worry runs the risk of becoming dispirited and disheartened as well, as they look at the political horizon and don't see a much brighter future. And then last, and this ties in and leads in nicely to Damon with the recommendations, we also came to the conclusion that Western engagement was very important. And we, on our February visit and our visit last week, got the clear impression that Ukrainians think the West is disengaging, both the European Union and the United States. And that is not only a perception problem, I think it's also a problem in reality, which is there is just not that much attention focused on Ukraine these days. There are efforts between Ukrainian officials and the EU to get the free trade agreement done, the association agreement done, and actually there's been some real progress there. But on the issues that we wrote about, we were there looking into democracy and human rights, there's a sense that there's not much attention being paid.
That's right. Maybe if I'll just pick up. Sure, I can pick up from that. And just to capture a couple of the conclusions, outline a little bit of where our analysis focused, and then walk through really, for the purpose of this group, the recommendations, how we would like to see things moving forward. I think first capturing the conclusions, I'm going to reiterate pointedly some of the points David made just to underscore. The conclusion of our effort was that Ukraine under President Yanukovych has become less democratic. And if left unchecked, Ukraine is headed towards autocracy and kleptocracy. Sort of the first significant conclusion. But second, we did conclude from our time there and from the discussions, our analysis, President Yanukovych and his government actually value their domestic standing, their international reputation, and therefore remain responsive to outside pressure. That underscores the importance of domestic actors in Ukraine, particularly civil society, but also the West, that we retain a capability, and we would argue we have a responsibility to check anti-democratic tendencies in Ukraine and support the constructive initiatives inside and outside the government. And then finally, that to some degree, Ukraine's political and cultural diversity, it functions as a bulwark against any one force dominating political space throughout the country. That's not an absolute, but there's a diversity there that's valuable when you think about it in this context. So the premise of our report is this concern, if left unchecked, headed towards autocracy and kleptocracy. But our argument is that this isn't an excuse for Western disengagement. It actually is a clarion call for what it isn't an excuse for Western disengagement. It's a call for Western engagement because we think it can be checked. So we came at this with a sense of humility, a sense of knowing that, particularly when we're in Ukraine meeting with civil society, Ukrainians know their country better than we do. We came at it as outside observers and those that actually care and value the nature of what's happening in Ukraine and the nature of our relationship. The shortcomings, the premise of this was built upon an analysis of the weak foundation since the Orange Revolution, failed expectations, the weak foundation that Ukraine finds itself on today, the electoral environment, corruption as a national security, corrosive national security threat, the role of the SBU Interior Ministry, judiciary, media, education, culture, religion, and then things that are happening within the regions, important trends within the regions. That's the premise, the structure of how we've gone throughout our analysis. I'm going to focus more on conclusions and recommendations. Essentially, the shortcomings of Ukraine's democratic experience to date are putting its future democratic development at risk. What the difficult recent past, I think, has bred both ambivalence at best and disillusionment at worst, both in terms of actors within inside Ukraine and its friends to some degree outside Ukraine. So we argue that we believe Ukraine is at an inflection point. The decisions and the actions of the Ukrainian government and civil society, opposition, political opposition, and the West, the decisions we're taking today, they will help determine whether the country gradually evolves into a European democracy or whether it slips back into a corrupt post-Soviet authoritarian state. Both of these futures are possible. Clearly, only one of them is preferable. What's been striking is that President Yanukovych has consistently articulated the goal of a Ukraine within Europe. Has put a priority, really, on the negotiations with the European Union right now for a deep comprehensive free trade agreement, for the association agreement. This is very good. But the country's not really on the path to achieve the vision that he's articulated. It's not just the process of technically meeting EU requirements, it's the values that underpin that type of commitment. So, if that's the vision, an independent sovereign Ukraine with a strong democratic institutions, free markets embedded in Europe with strong partnerships with the United States and Russia, then it requires certain actions. So in this context, we argue that the greatest threat to Ukraine today is not external, it's actually internal. It means that restoring the vision of a Ukraine as a democratic, market-oriented country that's a part of Europe, it actually remains within the control of the people of Ukraine today. That's positive, but it puts a burden of responsibility, particularly on the government, but also on civil society and the political opposition. This report is not black and white. It captures a nuanced picture. There is a positive reform agenda underway to some degree. The administrative reform, consolidation of agencies, a slew of legislation taking place within the Rada that had been backlogged for years, more progress with the European Union than we've seen since the Orange Revolution, progress on thorny bilateral issues with the United States. This government's been far more efficient at resolving some difficult economic investment cases than the previous government on a bilateral basis. And frankly, after what I view as the disastrous Kharkiv deal, the government has demonstrated a little bit more autonomy in its actions vis-a-vis Russia. So the outcome of this report is not hopeless. Ukraine can determine its own future. The West has a role to play. And the point that David made, that there is a perception in Ukraine that the West has lost interest, is quite important.